Clark, and I teach sourdough. I've been baking for about 10 years, and I've been doing sourdough for about 8 years. It took me, I tried doing sourdough at the same time that I started doing regular homemade bread, and it kept not working for me. It took maybe about like 2 years before I was able to like get a starter going and figure out how to make it work. And I couldn't figure out how to make it work for so long because I was trying to read the books or read stuff I could find online, and it was overwhelming and intimidating, mainly with the starter because it feels like there are so many variables to it, and it felt like everyone online had lots of opinions and really strong opinions.
There's one thing wrong, you're killing it all,
Yeah,
and your family,
and if you don't, and half the time it was if you're not doing it my way, well that's why it's failing, because you're not doing this specific thing or that specific thing. And I'd get overwhelmed and be like, well, you know what, we're not doing that. I'll just do this other thing that I know how to make it work. And then I found a Canadian homesteader on Instagram, and her whole point about anything that she does, whether it's like pressing cheese or making sourdough and bread, is she's like, the process needs to be streamlined enough that it can fit my lifestyle. I have no time or space for a recipe or a procedure or something that requires me to check in on it at very specific times. I can't live my life on that big schedule. It needs to be able to work with me. And she did live videos every single day where she was like, I'm going to get on at this time. Feed your starter with me. Okay, and then I'd come back the next day and I would take out my starter with her and copy exactly what she was doing. And that was the only way. But at that point, just the way she simplified it and doing it and seeing the steps all laid out in real time is what made it click for me, and realize the really, really cool thing about sourdough starter is they're live living things, and they respond to the input that you give them. They respond to how much food you give them. They respond in different ways to the temperature variations that you give them. But that's amazing, because that means that you can make them go faster or slower. You can make it work for you. And they're so forgiving. Like with traditional yeast from the store, because they have been selected to rise at a certain rate and to produce gas at a certain speed, which is pretty dang fast. If you miss that window of time, you've got maybe like 30 minutes to maybe an hour before the product is kind of a lost cause. Starter, your window of time is like many hours long, and it's much more forgiving. And so many people have so many opinions because it's so forgiving. You can do a lot of different things with it and it'll work. So this is the way I do starter and sourdough, and this is what works for me. This isn't the one right way to do it. My goal is to simply like provide an entry point and answer questions. And then if you need to do something different for you, or for the yeast that live in your house, or the type of water that you have, or the flour you use, you can alter it to make it work for you. Any questions yet? No? Okay. So the way I'm going to structure this is, first I'm going to take starter. If we start at the point in the process of saying, I've got my starter, I'm ready to mix bread. This is how we mix the bread. And then I'll pause, and then we can talk about taking care of the starter, how we feed it to use it, how we feed it to store it, to take care of it, how we can change our rise times with different things, and how we can get it to taste more sour if we like that, or less sour if we don't like that, all that sort of stuff. But just to start out, we're going to go through how to make a basic sourdough artisan rule. So you want to start out with a container to mix it in. I like clear containers because then it's easier for me to gauge how much it has risen. I normally never use a container this small because I almost never mix a single loaf because that feels like a waste of my time because my family goes through so much. I'm always making at least a double, usually a quadruple sized batch. So I'm usually using like big bowls. I like bowls that have lids because it makes life easy, but if you don't have a lid, that's totally fine. I'll also just like get a cloth, get it wet, and drape it like a tea towel and drape it over, and then put a plate or a tray on top to kind of help lock in the moisture when it's time for it to rise. But for today, I'm just doing a little teeny tiny baby. So we start out with our water in the container that you're mixing in. This recipe calls for 350 grams of water. I always weigh my ingredients when I'm baking, just because the weights when you're feeding starter or whatever, a lot of times you're going to be doing equal weights of water and flour, but while they might weigh the same amount, they will not necessarily come to the same place if you're if you're measuring it in a measuring cup or something. And it's easier to get consistent results if you're weighing your ingredients, because it's more exact. If you're filling up your cup, your measuring cup with a cup of flour, you're not necessarily going to be getting the exact same amount of flour every single time. But if you want to dry measure it, do that. Who cares? But I weigh mine. So I've already got my water in here, 350 grams of water. If I forget to mention the temperature of the water, remind me to circle back to it. Next, we're going to add in our active starter. I like to add the starter into the water next because I can then mix it around and just help the starter disperse a little more easily, so that then when I put the flour in, it's just easier to make sure that all the yeast get everywhere they need to go. The starter I'm using today, I did mark it, which was smart of me. Okay. Because I'm going to be taking from this, I just want to show where the starter's at. So this line, I fed this starter this morning at just about 8:30. Usually I never feed it the morning that I'm going to be mixing dough. I usually want to feed it like 8 to 12 hours beforehand. So if I hadn't forgotten, last night I would have fed my starter last night, and it would have been probably up here at this point in the morning, but I forgot. But that was okay, because starter is flexible. It wants to work with us. I know that I've been feeding it every single day, multiple times a day sometimes for the past couple days, so I already knew that it is extremely active and extremely happy. So I knew that it would be okay for me to feed it when I got here this morning, and I took it outside after I fed it because it is warmer outside than it is in here. Temperature matters a lot when you're doing sourdough, because the yeast, they're live living things, and if they are in a cold environment, whether it's a cold building or house, or if you put it in the fridge, cold slows them down, so they're going to be less active, and they're going to take longer to rise and get to the point that you want. And I think it's kind of chilly in here, and I wanted them to rise as much as possible, so I took them outside because it's warmer. And when it's warmer, they're going to be faster acting. They're going to be way more active. This hasn't fully doubled in size, but I can tell that it has risen significantly, so it's good enough to use. And another surefire way to make sure that your starter is ready to use is you want to see it float when you put it into the water, or at least have some kind of buoyancy. Maybe it doesn't completely float like the boat on top of the water, but as long as it's not completely sinking down to the bottom, it's fine. So we'll see how much this one floats. I'm also going to put a little bit of another starter in here just to test out. So this is a jar of starter that I fed, what's today? Sunday. So this is starter that I fed Friday night. So I have not opened this jar or touched it since Friday, and it's still very happy looking. So I'm just curious to see if it will do any floating right now. But that's also because this is starter that has been consistently fed on a daily basis for multiple days now. So and I also want to show once it's been sitting around a long time, once it's been sitting around a long time, the starter's going to get really loose and more watery. I feed my starter really, really thick, so this is way looser than it started out as. So I'm just gonna, and even that one still floats. So if I was looking for a more sour flavor and taste, I would go with the starter that has been sitting around longer, that's still active enough to act as the yeast in this bread that I'm making. If I did not like a super sour flavor, I would go with the starter that hasn't been sitting around as long or rising as long, if that makes sense. Yeah, more or less. So I'm actually going to use this one because I like the more sour flavor. And if you're doing sourdough for the gut benefits and the health part of it, the more sour it is means the longer it's had time to ferment, and it's the fermentation that kind of helps to break down the components of the flour. So that's another reason to go with more sour. So I actually don't need to, well, I actually do want to see if this one floats too, though. And you can tell this one is nowhere near as watery or as liquidy, but they were fed the same ratios of flour to water to the amount of starter that started out in here. Okay, I just want to see it. And like it cools. And that one floats too. So this is after 8, 9, 10, 11. This is after not even a full 3 hours from being fed. And this is over 24 hours after being fed. If it's healthy, again, it's not fussy. It will work with you. So I'm going to weigh out 50 grams of this. Because of this stuff in here, it's going to be more than 50 grams, but who cares? It's going to work anyways. It's going to be fine. So I'm just going to pour out. And then I'm going to mix the starter around into the water. You can use a spoon, a fork, whatever you feel like. My personal preference is a sauce whisk because that's what I like using. You don't have to. You can use whatever you want. That's good enough. So we've got 350 grams of water, 50 grams of active starter. Now we're going to add our flour. This recipe that I use calls for bread flour. We use bread flour because it has a higher protein content, and protein is one of the things that helps the dough to develop its gluten structure. The gluten structure is basically the bones or the framework of the bread, and when it's well developed, that means that it can hold on to the air and gas produced by the yeast better, and that's what gives you a really beautiful shaped loaf of bread. You don't have to use bread flour. If you are making a recipe that calls for bread flour and you don't have any, whether you mill your own flour or grind it, or I don't do it, so I don't know what it's called. Or you have all-purpose flour. Do that. See what happens. It'll probably be fine. But I like bread flour, and so I use bread flour. And then, so we're doing 500 grams. This is, I already know that I've got 250 bread flour in here.
second guessing herself. No, you did. You had to.
No, I was trying to decide, do I want to keep this open to put utensils in, and I thought, no, I want to keep it. There was a whole
There's
conversation
a lot
that
going on.
happened.
I see it. I know. We appreciate you.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn on my scale. And I have two scales. This is my new one, and I hate it because it turns off really, really quickly. So I'm sitting here trying to get all of my flour in before it turns off. All right. And again, you don't have to be super precious with being exact with your flour. If it's a little over,
So how
that's
many
fine.
grams of flour?
500 grams of flour.
Yeah, she just bought a scale, just ordered it, so now it's, we didn't think about how long does it stay on for.
Well, as long as it's like receiving weight input,
Okay.
it's fine. But my other scale,
touching it.
no, I seriously, I have to keep like tap, because my other scale will stay on for probably a solid minute without any input, and this one,
15 seconds.
it's not much, and I've been burned one too many times from I've got my stuff on my scale and I weigh out my flour, but then I'm all out of flour and I'm only halfway through, so then I go to open up another bag, and by the time I get back it's gone off, and I'm like, well, I guess we're eyeballing this one.
Yeah.
And again, it usually turns out
It's
fine. It's totally fine.
But it's
now,
extra anxiety that you do not need.
exactly. I like knowing that the numbers are there. And so we've got 350 grams of water, 50 grams active starter, 500 grams bread flour, and now 9 grams of salt. Another reason I really like weighing stuff is I really like salt, so we have lots of different types of salt. And when I'm making bread, I'm just going to grab whichever salt is close at hand. So this is 9 grams of table salt, but 9 grams of table salt is going to measure out differently than sea salt, or than if I'm cracking pink Himalayan salt or whatever it is. But if you're weighing it, it doesn't matter how much physical space it's taking up, because the weight is going to be the same and consistent every single time. And I add the salt last because one time I added my water and I added my starter and I mixed it together, and then I threw in the salt, and the salt killed the yeast, and it all clumped up, and it looked like I was making mozzarella, and it was horrible.
Oh, no.
And I had to restart. So now I just put it in last. And now we're gonna mix it together. You can mix it with whatever you feel like using. This is my favorite thing to use. I like that it's not a spoon. For whatever reason, for me, I feel like spoons don't incorporate it very well. I have a dough whisk. I hate using it for dough. I feel like it doesn't do a good enough job to warrant the amount of time and anger that cleaning out the dough from all the little pieces causes. So I usually start with a wooden spoon or paddle, and then I just finish incorporating it with my hands. We're not worried about kneading it right now or developing any kind of structure. We're just bringing it together so that the whole thing gets all mixed and hydrated, and then we're going to put a lid on it and set it aside for 30 minutes. For the past 8 years, I thought that the process of letting it sit to the side so that the flour can soak up all of the water and get fully hydrated, I thought that that was called autolyse. And I learned yesterday that technically autolyse is only if it's flour and water sitting together, and once you add yeast and salt to it, it's a different name for the process. I didn't know that. But we're gonna let it sit and get fully wet before we play with it again. And one of the reasons I like adding the dry or the wet ingredients before I do the dry is it just helps make sure that there aren't dry pockets of flour hiding out anywhere. Yes.
Do you ever mix in your starter with the water and then add the flour?
Yes. That's what I did here, right?
Okay, I might have missed that.
Oh no, sorry. No, I was like, hold on, what did I say? Yeah, so it goes water, starter, I mix those guys together,
Gotcha.
then I do the flour, and then I do the salt.
Okay.
And I'll usually have like a bucket of, or bowl of water, a jar of water in the sink or something, so that as soon as I'm done with my utensils, I can just immediately put them in water so that they don't dry out and become a nightmare to clean. So that's about as pulled together as I usually end up getting with a spoon or paddle or something. So I'm going to put on gloves and just finish squishing it together with my hands. Are there any questions?
No, you're doing really good so far.
You guys are doing really good. We're almost done with your bread.
So the point right now is just to make sure that there's not any massively dry bits of flour. I'm just pulling it all together into like a shaggy dough essentially.
You don't mind starting? You guys want to see? You guys back there? Okay. Take it over there. I just got places so we can take it.
Alright,
I got you.
I'm gonna say that's what I'm looking for. That's good enough to me. It's not pretty, but it doesn't need to be.
It'll be beautiful when it's done.
Say what?
It'll be beautiful when it's done.
Yes, ma'am. Take that off now.
How do you do it?
And now I'm gonna put a lid on it so it can sit and get fully hydrated for 30 minutes. And make sure that I let it go for 30 minutes. Awesome. And again, if the thing that you're mixing it in, if the thing that you're mixing it in has a lid, awesome, use that. Or get a towel damp and put it on top. Just cover it so that it doesn't lose moisture because we're trying to hydrate it, not. Okay, so while it sits for 30 minutes, we can talk about taking care of starter. Just by a show of hands, who here has worked with starter before or tried working with starter before? Most people, okay.
Like once or twice, and I gave up.
Okay. Who has no idea what starter is? Anyone?
Me.
Okay. Okay. So, starter is wild caught yeast. If you're baking something from, if you're baking with yeast that you bought from the store, it's yeast that has been intentionally selected to do its job at a certain speed. It's also a living thing. It's just as alive as this yeast, but this yeast is simply whatever is naturally living and occurring in your kitchen. You put out water and food, and you basically trapped it, and then by continually feeding it and keeping the good yeast alive, they are creating an environment in that jar where the bad stuff basically can't survive, and it's only the good stuff. The only thing that transitioned me from not being able to do starter to being able to keep starter alive or get yeast alive was I had to start thinking about them as my little pets. Because a pet is something that you have to check in on at least once a day, and you have to make sure that it has food and water, otherwise your pet will die. It's, I'm not gonna go into it.
Yeah, no, go, because mine.
We're a reptile family, and so we've got a leopard gecko, and so I'm thinking like, well, yeast is kind of more like a reptile to me than it is a cat or dog. With reptile, we only need to feed him like once or twice a week, and that's kind of how the yeast are, like depending on what you want to do with them. If you're just caring about keeping them alive, you feed them once a week, they're fine. If you're wanting to work with it, you need to feed it daily. But back to the beginning, how do you get a starter? There are basically two ways you can get a starter. One, you can make it yourself, which means you go to your space, wherever you're wanting to make your starter and use it, and get a clean container, and you're going to put equal parts of flour and equal parts of water into the jar, and you're going to leave it on the counter with a cloth over it. You don't want to fully seal it because you want the stuff, the little microscopic yeast that are hanging out and about, you want them to get into that jar because you're trying to catch them. But you don't want it fully open to the air because, I mean, gnats and flies and dust, and we don't want that. You can find lots of different instructions online, I mean, cookbooks about what ratios to use to make a starter, yes.
Doesn't matter what kind of flour.
I was gonna get to that. Again, different people have different opinions. My default go-to is this cookbook. This is what I have had the most success with. And I believe she calls for using, or for starting out with whole wheat flour when you're trying to establish a starter. Maybe it does. Yeah, so she calls for starting out with 60 grams of whole wheat flour and 60 grams of water, and then leaving it alone for 24 hours. After 24 hours, you come back to it, you throw away half of it, and then you feed it again with 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour. But after the very first feed where you're using whole wheat flour, you can just switch to regular all-purpose or whatever it is that you're wanting to bake with. As a general rule of thumb, whatever type of flour you're planning on using as your predominant, like go-to, this is the type of flour I'm probably going to be using the most, use that type of flour to feed your starter. I don't technically follow that rule because it is harder for me to find bread flour than it is for me to find all-purpose flour. It's white flour, like well, it's not white, it's hard red wheat. They're both the same type of flour. They're similar enough that I feed the starter the thing that's easier for me to get a lot of, and I save the stuff that it's harder for me to get a lot of for baking. Do whatever you feel like. But to establish your starter, so you start out with your whole wheat flour and your water, loosely cover it, leave it alone for 24 hours, you come back to it, you take away some of it, just throw it away, there's nothing to do with it. Give it more food and water, leave it for 24 hours, and then for the next couple days, if you can, you want to feed it twice a day. So morning and evening, or whatever schedule works for you, having the time to be about 12 hours apart if you can. And again, discard, getting rid of half of what you've got in your jar and replenishing it with equal weights of flour and water. And you just keep doing that until you notice that it's starting to bubble and double in size, and it's got a yeasty smell that smells good to you. And at that point, you've got an established starter. Because if you have this much in your jar and you feed it, it's going to double and you're going to end up with this much. And then if you feed this much that's in your jar, you're going to end up with this much. because it doubles every single time, or it should double every single time, you're going to end up with a monster if you don't get rid of some of it.
Can
You
you
can't
use-
afford to keep feeding the whole thing.
Can you use the discard for it for other things before it starts fermenting?
Before it's an established
Yeah.
starter. I don't.
So just throw all that away and
Some people might say you can. I don't, because in my head, the thing that makes the starter safe is that
ferment.
yeast activity, and I just don't really feel like risking it until I know that it's a safe environment and there's a lot of healthy yeast in there, making sure that no bad bacteria or yeast are going to be able to survive. That's the only time that what I'm taking out, that's the only time that I throw it away, is when I'm establishing my starter. Sometimes, just my personal experience, sometimes it's been very easy for me to make a starter, and I've gotten it going in 4 days, 5 days, and it's been super easy. And sometimes I've been trying to get a starter for 2 weeks going, and it's just not working. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's whatever that particular assortment of yeast that are living in my space at the time are doing, or the humidity, or the temperature. It just sometimes doesn't work, in which case I say, well,
better luck next time.
oh well, I might, yeah, and then I'll forget about it and just let it sit, and then I usually end up throwing it away and trying it again in a couple weeks. If I'm on top of my game, when I do have an established starter going and it's bubbling and it's really happy, before I do anything else, I will take a tray and I'll put a piece of parchment paper on it, or silicone mat, or whatever you use, and take a couple spoonfuls of the very, very active, very happy starter, and I'll spread it on the tray, and I'll let it dry until it's like crispy and you can break it apart. And then I'll put it in a jar or bag and stick it in the freezer, so that if I do eventually end up killing my starter, I've got backup that I can rehydrate. There are other ways to preserve your sourdough starter. Apparently you can just like put the thing in the freezer, right? Like the happy starter in the freezer, but I've never tried that one. I'm gonna try it when I go home tonight. But I like trying to make sure that I've got backup. The other way you can get the starter is to get it from someone else, and then you're going to need to feed it. So if we go into the point, now you've got active starter, whether you have caught it yourself or you've gotten it from someone else, you have to take care of it. When you're taking care of it, you're basically asking yourself what you're going to do with it, because you're going to do one of two things. You're either feeding your starter because you want to bake with it and you have plans to bake with it as soon as it's ready, or you're feeding it because you want to keep it alive, but you're not ready to deal with it right now. You're not ready to bake with it, but you don't want to kill it, so you're going to feed it and you're going to put it in the fridge, because when it goes into cold temperatures, a cold environment, they're going to slow down and they're basically going to go to sleep. If you have fed your starter and you put it in the fridge, you can easily leave it in there without touching it for a week. Usually, that's my experience. If you still don't want to bake with it, you can take it out, feed it again, put it back in the fridge, and you can do that indefinitely. I have also left my starter in the fridge, from feeding it to putting it in the fridge. I've left it in there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks without touching it, and then take it out and feed it and try to get it going again to be able to bake with it. If it's been sitting in there for multiple weeks, it might require 2 or 3 feedings with like a 12-hour interval, perhaps. Yes.
I'm sorry, another random question.
Yes.
Does the kind of water matter, like tap versus spring versus...
So this is something that a lot of people have very strong opinions about. I do not have strong opinions about it. Because all I know is my experience. and none of my friends, I don't know anyone personally who also does sourdough, so all I have is what I personally experienced, and then just random strangers that I've seen online, and they say all kinds of random stuff. I'm from Nashville. I live in the city. I'm on city water, city pipes, all of that kind of stuff. I have never had a problem with my tap water. My tap water is totally fine. I've also used filtered water. That works totally fine. I have not personally found the type of water that I use to have any effect on what I'm doing. But I don't know where you live or what the makeup of your water is, so maybe it's different for you. If you feel like the water that you're using is the weak link in your success, then try using a different type of water and see if that changes things. And if it does, then maybe it is a problem for you. But I have never experienced water being a problem. Does that answer it?
Yes.
Okay.
Figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it I use tap water and it's not a problem. But so that's keeping it in the fridge. If you are feeding it because you're ready to bake with it, you're either going to pull it out of the fridge or it's already on your counter because you've been using it and we need to get it bubbly and happy so you can use it. You're going to feed it. How do we feed it? Again, there are lots of opinions. The standard is feed equal parts starter, flour, and water. So if you're not planning on doing a bunch of like 10 loaves of bread, loaves, if you're not planning on doing like 4, 8, 10 loaves of bread, you don't need your end amount of starter to be huge. If you're planning on just making one recipe and you're not doubling it, you only need 50, for this recipe, you only need 50 grams of active starter to make this recipe. So your end product, what you end up with of happy double risen starter, you're not going to want to end up with more than, say, 100 grams of starter. So you don't need to be starting out with a huge amount. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm confusing myself. Okay. So if I were to have taken this jar out of the fridge, or when I go home, I'll feed this. I will remove probably all but 50 grams of starter from this jar. Whether I have an empty jar just like this so that I can tar it off on the scale and know exactly how much starter is in here, or whether I get an empty clean jar and I put 50 grams into it, I'm only going to be feeding 50 grams of starter. And then you can feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water.
Do you need the flour and the water mixed together to feed it, or do you put them in separately and feed
You
it?
can put it in separately. I usually pour my water in first and then my flour, just because
Easier.
that's a habit, and I'm a creature of habit, and if I'm going to do it the same way every time, it doesn't matter. You can do it either way, whatever you like.
As long as it all gets in there.
As long as it gets in there. And then you're going to mix it all together. You can use a spoon, you can use a fork, you can use whatever makes you happy. I'll usually use a fork to mix it together just because I feel like it's easier to break up the clumps of flour. You don't have to. Another thing that people have very strong opinions about is the material of the utensils that you're using for your starter.
Use metal.
Did you have a question?
No, I already know which argument you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it matters. If someone else does, that's great. If you feel like it matters, cool. Do what you feel like. I've not experienced any difference whether I use metal or wood. Or plastic. But I don't think I've ever used plastic. But that's just because I don't think I have any utensils that are plastic. like I've used a silicone, yes,
Dough scraper.
or not even, not for mixing, but like a
Spatula.
spatula, thank you. But again, I've not noticed any difference. But if you feel like it makes a difference, cool, I love that for you. Go with that then. But in my 8 years of doing this, I have not noticed a difference. So you have the amount of starter that you're feeding. You feed it water, you feed it flour, you mix it together, you set it aside on the counter. In general, it's going to take 8 to 12 hours-ish for your starter to get to the point where you're wanting it to be to use. You're usually looking for your starter to double in size. You can also just double check yourself by taking a scoop of the starter, and if it floats in water, you're good to go. Depending on how cold or warm your water is, and how cold or warm your house is, or wherever you're mixing the starter, it might take more time for the starter to double and be ready to use. It might take less time for the starter to double and be ready to use. I usually like to feed if I'm at home and not prepping for a class or anything, I like to feed my starter in the morning, so it has about 12 hours throughout the day to double and get to the point where I want to use it. So it's ready by evening time, because I like to mix my bread dough in the evening so it can sit for its full rise overnight, and then I can bake it the following morning. That's what works for me. The inverse of that would be to feed your starter in the evening before going to bed so it can rise and double overnight, and then your dough would be ready for you to mix in the morning, and then your dough would kind of have more or less the whole day to do its rise, and then your dough would be ready to bake the following evening. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
You're still doing amazing.
Thank you. Feeding your starter. Oh, so if you've taken your starter out of the fridge because you're wanting to bake with it, and you feed 30 grams or 50 grams of your starter, 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of water, if it's been in your fridge for a couple weeks and it's been a little while since it was last fed, it might not be ready after 12 hours. If you check on it after 12 hours and it's really not doing much of anything, maybe it's getting a little bubbly, but it's not floating in water and it's not really doubled, it's not broken, it's not bad, it's just really sleepy because it's been a while since it's eaten, and you just need to give it another feed. Sometimes it might need 2 or 3 feedings to get active and going. It just depends. Maybe it'll take a lot more, like, just because it's not where you expect it to be, it's fine. Don't throw it away. Don't freak out. As long as it's not colorful or fuzzy or smelling bad, it's fine. Get rid of most of it so that you still have a little bit left to feed, and feed it again. And keep at it, and it'll be fine. Which kind of brings us to discard. Is everyone comfortable knowing what discard is, or is discard confusing at all?
Comfortable.
Say what?
Comfortable.
Okay. So discard is basically, we're not going to feed everything that we have. We're only going to feed a portion of it, and even if it's active, happy starter, whatever we're not feeding and whatever we're not using in our dough that we're mixing, that's called discard. Some people throw it away. Don't do that, because it's really good stuff. It's been working on fermentation. It's got that really sour flavor. It's got all of that acidity to it. It's really yummy and great. Don't get rid of it. I have a jar in my fridge labeled discard. Every time I am feeding my dough I'm feeding my starter and I have discard, I will just add it all to the same jar, so my jar will fill up. because I love baking with it. It makes things way more sour and tart. Depending on how old the discard is in there, unless you've just recently added discard to it, you're not going to have very many live yeast in there. So when you use discard in recipes, you're not using it for height. You're not using it to bring height to the thing. You're just using it for flavor and texture. So I like to use, my favorite things to use discard in are discard pancakes, discard waffles, discard biscuits. You can just take the discard and straight pour it into a hot pan on the stove and make like flatbreads and stuff. I will take my discard and mix it with a little bit of flour and spent roux grains and butter, and then spread it out and make crackers with it, and they're so good. They're amazing.
Sorry, what did you say you did that?
For mine, I just add some, there's a recipe on the King Arthur Flour website, which is what is the best. It's just flour and butter and whatever herbs and spices you like, but I add spent roux grain to mine because I like the flavor and texture that it gives. But that's because we brew at home, and this is a rabbit hole, but my husband, you know, he grinds his own grains and stuff for that. We can't get it fine enough for flour, which is why I don't want my own flour. But after he brews with his grains, I take them and I dehydrate them, and then I put them in the food processor, and it ends up being kind of like a crumbly, sandy sort of texture, so I don't use a whole lot of it, but it has like this, like, really like nutty kind of flavor almost, and it's super fantastic. But that's a rabbit hole. But save your discard. You can use it for stuff, and I have let my discard sit in. I'm sure there are official rules about how long discard can be in the fridge. If in order to be comfortable and feel safe, you want to be on the very like conservative side of it, then you know, only keep it for maybe 2 to 4 weeks. I've let mine sit in there for like a couple months, and I go more by if I look at it and it looks fine and it smells fine, I say that it's fine for me and our usage. But again, trust your gut and your instincts. If it feels uncomfortable to you, then don't use it. When the starter, when it's in the discard jar and it's discard and it's just sitting in the fridge, if it's sitting there for a long time, it's going to eventually end up producing a liquid that sits on the top of the discard starter, and it's called hooch. It's technically very slightly alcoholic, not enough to do anything, but if that's something that you want to completely avoid, you can pour it off. It doesn't affect a single thing. You can mix it back into the jar. That's what I do because I want to punch up that flavor as much as I can. The top of it, it might end up looking kind of dark brownish or grayish. That color family is okay. It will get a strong smell, kind of like almost acetone, like nail polishy sort of strong smell, which while it's not pleasant, it's not unsafe. That smell profile is okay. In both the discard and your starter, when you're mixing it, the signs to watch out for, that means something bad has gotten in there and you need to just chuck it and start over. Anything that's colorful, if there's any blues, greens, yellows, pinks, reds, nope, it's done. Something's gotten in there and there's no saving it. We're not going to mess with that. Throw it out. If you see anything fuzzy in there, that's not good. You know what mold looks like. If you see mold, it's bad. White, that's another bad color. But if it's like you're like, oh, it kind of just looks like it's darker on top, or like it's got that, you know, grayishy sort of color. That's okay. That just means it's been sitting there for a while, but it's not got bad stuff in it. Any questions at this point? No. Okay. All right. Yes.
When my problem that I have is overproofing my loaf. So I've already stirred it up, I auto-laced it, and then I put it in a bowl. It's all temperature depending, and yada yada yada. And I don't have a straight-sided bowl that's clear, so maybe that might be the solution to my problem.
I mean, I was gonna
Is
talk
there
about
any
that
way
when
to
I got
save
to that point in the dough process, but my first question is, do you have any idea of how long you're letting your dough sit for its bulk rise when it gets overproofed?
It's an extreme variety. So like
Okay.
in the winter, you know, like sometimes it actually takes 18 hours for it to double, but in the summer it might take an hour and a half for it to double. So then, you know, when I mix it all this morning and I'm gonna bake it that night, it's already overproofed. And so I'm just wondering if the loaf is ready to fold and go into shape and put in a pan, but it's overproofed. Is there any way to
There's not really any way to rescue it. I
enjoy it?
wish we hadn't
Make
made
it a fried bread?
yesterday I brought a loaf to the workshop that I had baked the night before that I had overproofed in every step. Like, I had overproofed it in the bulk rise, I had overproofed it in the second shaping rise, and it looked like a giant hockey puck, you know? But the smell was great, the color was great. It was a little tougher and chewier, but I still baked it and my kids still ate it, you know? And there are different things that you could do with that bread if it's not pleasant to eat. You could turn it into croutons or breadcrumbs, or, you know. But for that specific, you're saying it's such a wide range for when it overproofs. If you're at home and you're fine and happy to kind of babysit it a little bit, like where you check in on it every hour or 2 hours, you can do that and just try to catch it.
Yeah, I can definitely catch it before it overproofs.
But that's annoying.
During the day.
There's not really anything to do about it. You can control. If you're happy babysitting it, cool, do that. You could, if you've got a basement or if you have space in your fridge and it's summertime and you notice that it's, like you said, ready to go in an hour, put it in the fridge, put it in the basement, because you can dramatically slow it down by giving it a cold environment. Use cold water when you mix your dough. Don't start it out with warm water, because using cold water will slow it down as well.
Do you micro bakery at all?
Say what?
Do you have like a micro bakery, or is this just a home? I just noticed that like some of my friends that have a micro bakery, you know, they're making like 20 loaf doughs, right? They cut it up and they measure it and shape it and whatever. And they put it in their refrigerator to dry. And I'm just like, how long does that take? You know, like give me more information, because like that's insane. I guess it's more controlled environment because it's in a refrigerator.
It does a pretty good consistent job of, like, if I mix it in the morning and I put it in the fridge in the morning, it's usually gonna react pretty well and do what I want it to do if I pull it out later on that evening. Like, give or take, like,
So regardless of the season.
yeah, regardless of the season, the fridge it really makes a controlled environment that's cold, and there's not a huge humidity change in the fridge. So if you're looking for consistency and you're wanting it to have, say, a standard